They say love fades with time, slipping quietly into the background of life until it's barely recognizable. I thought I knew that truth well enough. After all, Heward and I had been married nearly 50 years, our lives woven together in ways I never thought to question. But then I met Taylo, my young, talented art student, whose passion reignited something in me that I'd thought was long gone. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. His gaze seeing through the layers I'd wrapped around myself. It was innocent at first, just talks about art and the world beyond. But when we crossed that line, everything changed. I didn't realize that. In my pursuit of that brief thrill, I would set off a chain of events that would unravel not only my family, but the foundations of everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and loyalty. Looking back now, I see Taylo was never just a passing spark. He was the match that set everything ablaze. It was a Tuesday afternoon, early in the semester, when Taylo walked into my studio. The other students were already seated, their heads bent over sketchbooks, barely paying attention to the new arrival. But Taylo carried an energy that immediately caught my eye. He wasn't like the other students, older by a few years, with a maturity that made him stand out among the usual crowd of fresh-faced undergraduates. "Is there a seat for me, Miss Mara?" he asked, his voice carrying an unusual blend of confidence and curiosity. He had a slight accent, one that I couldn't quite place, and a smile that lingered just long enough to make me feel noticed. I gestured toward an empty stool by the window. "Help yourself. We're just getting started." As Taylo settled in, I continued with the class, moving around the room as I always did, offering comments and suggestions on technique. I was aware of him watching me, his eyes tracing my movements. The attention was flattering in a way I hadn't felt in years, though I told myself it was nothing more than a young man admiring his teacher's expertise. At the end of class, as the students filed out, Taylo stayed behind, lingering by the easels as if he had something on his mind. I packed up my things, pretending not to notice his hesitation. "Miss Mara," he finally spoke, his voice quiet yet firm. "Your work, I can tell you're an artist, not just a teacher. I've seen your paintings in the local galleries. I wanted to tell you how inspiring they are." His compliment was simple, but it struck a chord. I hadn't felt truly seen in years, my art a quiet passion that I pursued in solitude. I managed a smile, trying to maintain my composure. "Thank you, Taylo. I'm glad my work resonates with you." Over the next few weeks, he continued to linger after class, asking questions about technique and color, engaging me in conversations about art and life. He had a depth and insight that I found surprising for someone his age, and I found myself looking forward to our exchanges, savoring the intellectual connection that had grown between us. But it was more than just the art that brought him to me, and more than the teaching that kept me intrigued. I noticed the way he watched me, his gaze lingering a little too long, his words laced with a subtle admiration that I tried to ignore. In those moments, I felt the years between us melt away, my heartbeat quickening like it hadn't in decades. I told myself it was harmless, just a professional admiration. But deep down, I knew that something in me had already crossed an invisible line. Taylo's presence became a regular fixture in my days, like a brushstroke I hadn't intended but couldn't erase. Each week after class, he'd find a reason to linger, asking questions that grew increasingly personal, peeling back layers I'd kept hidden for years. I told myself I was simply guiding a talented student, that my interest was purely professional. But in the quiet of my mind, I knew better. One evening after class, Taylo asked if he could see my personal studio, curious to learn about my own art process beyond what I shared in class. I hesitated, knowing how intimate such an invitation was. My studio was my sanctuary, a place where I allowed my thoughts and feelings to bleed onto the canvas without judgment or constraint. But as I looked at him, his eyes filled with genuine curiosity and admiration, I felt a strange urge to say yes, to share this part of myself with someone who seemed to truly appreciate it. Tomorrow after class, I heard myself say, as if the decision had been made outside my control. The next day, he arrived with a quiet reverence, his gaze sweeping over the canvases leaning against the walls, unfinished pieces capturing moments of my own life, emotions I rarely shared with anyone. He studied each one carefully, moving from one painting to the next with an attention that was almost reverential. "These are remarkable," he murmured, his voice filled with something I couldn't quite place. "There's so much life here. Like each brushstroke has a memory." I felt my cheeks flush, a reaction I hadn't had in years. "Thank you, Taylo. These pieces, they're more personal than what I show in galleries. I paint to remember, to keep parts of myself alive." He nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "That's why I wanted to be your student. I've seen a lot of art, but yours, it feels like it has a soul." His words struck me deeply, and I felt a strange connection take root between us, something beyond teacher and student, beyond mentor and admirer. It was as though he saw me, really saw me. And I found myself craving that feeling, even as I knew how dangerous it was. As he left that evening, I realized with a pang that I was already looking forward to the next time, to the conversations that had become a bright spot in my otherwise routine life. For the first time in years, I felt alive, and while I knew the risks, I couldn't deny the thrill of rediscovering a part of myself I thought was long gone. The delicate rhythm I'd established with Tylo was thrown off one Friday afternoon when Ivania, my daughter, appeared at my front door unexpectedly. She had a way of coming and going from my life, a pattern that mirrored our complicated relationship. We hadn't spoken in months, and I sensed a tension in her gaze, a mixture of curiosity and something darker. "Mom," she said, her tone carefully guarded, "I thought I'd stop by. It's been a while." I invited her in, feeling a familiar unease settle over me. Ivania and I had a strained relationship, one shaped by years of misunderstandings, by choices I'd made that she could never quite forgive. I'd been an artist before a mother, and in her eyes, that had always made me selfish. Our conversations were often filled with unspoken accusations, a reminder of the guilt I carried, but rarely acknowledged. We sat at the kitchen table, exchanging small talk that felt both superficial and loaded. I could tell she had something on her mind, but I didn't press, knowing that Ivania preferred to approach things on her own terms. After a few moments, she leaned forward, her gaze searching. "Mom, is everything okay? You seem different." I forced a smile, trying to deflect her suspicion. "I'm fine, Ivania, just focused on my work as usual." She studied me for a moment, her gaze narrowing. "You've seemed distant lately. I just wanted to check in." Her concern was both touching and disconcerting, a reminder that even though we were often at odds, she still cared. But as she continued to observe me, I felt an undercurrent of suspicion, as if she sensed something was off. I quickly changed the subject, steering the conversation away from myself and toward her life, her career, anything that would shift the focus. Ivania, ever perceptive, picked up on my discomfort but allowed the topic to drift, though I could tell she wasn't fully convinced. After she left, I felt a lingering sense of unease, as though her visit had left a crack in the carefully constructed world I'd created with Tylo. It was a reminder of the risks I was taking, of the people who would be hurt if they discovered the truth. But even as the guilt gnawed at me, I couldn't bring myself to let go. The connection with Tylo had become a lifeline, something I wasn't ready to abandon. One evening after class, Tylo and I lingered in the studio, our conversation flowing naturally as we discussed art, philosophy, and the deeper meanings behind our work. The studio was quiet. The only sound, the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the soft rustle of our voices. There was an intimacy in the air, a tension that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. As we moved around the room, Studying the canvases, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine in a way that was both casual and electric. I felt a jolt of warmth spread through me, and when I looked up, his gaze met mine, filled with a mixture of admiration and something deeper. Without thinking, I took a step closer, feeling the pull between us, the unspoken connection that had been simmering for weeks. It was as though we were both suspended in that moment, caught between the boundaries of right and wrong, yet unable to resist the pull. And then, without warning, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both gentle and filled with an intensity that left me breathless. It was a crossing of lines, a step into forbidden territory that felt both thrilling and terrifying. When we finally pulled apart, I felt a rush of emotions: joy, fear, guilt, all mingling together in a way that left me feeling both exhilarated and unsteady. Tylo looked at me, his eyes filled with a tenderness I hadn't seen in years, a reminder that I was still capable of feeling, of being seen in a way that went beyond the ordinary. "I shouldn't have done that," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He shook his head, a soft smile on his lips. "Neither should I, but I'm glad I did." We stood in silence for a moment, each of us grappling with the reality of what we'd just done. I knew the consequences that could come from this, the people who would be hurt, the life I'd built that could crumble. But in that moment, all I felt was the warmth of his presence, the quiet joy of being wanted, of feeling alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. When he finally left, I felt a strange mix of elation and dread, a recognition that I had stepped onto a path I couldn't easily turn back from. I told myself it was just a moment, a brief lapse that meant nothing. But deep down, I knew that I was already in too deep, that the line we'd crossed had changed everything. The days after that evening were filled with a new tension, an awareness of the risk I was taking, of the secret I was now harboring. I tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, keeping my interactions with Tylo professional during class, though the memory of that kiss lingered, a quiet thrill that I couldn't entirely shake. Ivania's visits became more frequent, and each time I felt her gaze on me, her suspicion growing. She had always been perceptive, able to pick up on the smallest shifts in my behavior, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she confronted me. Her suspicions weren't helped by Calder, my husband Heward's old friend, who had always been nosy, his loyalty to Heward making him an ever-watchful presence. Calder had been a friend of ours for decades, though he had a way of prying into matters that weren't his concern. His loyalty a double-edged sword that I both appreciated and resented. One afternoon, Calder dropped by unannounced, his eyes sweeping over my studio with a look that was both curious and probing. He made small talk, asking about my work, my classes, but I sensed an undercurrent of suspicion, as though he was searching for something, a hint of impropriety he could report back to Heward. As he left, I felt a pang of anxiety, a reminder that the life I'd built was now a fragile house of cards, one that could collapse with the slightest nudge. I knew I had to be careful, to keep my emotions in check, to hide the connection with Tylo that had become both a lifeline and a source of danger. But even as the risks mounted, I couldn't bring myself to let go. Tylo had become a part of me, a piece of my life that I wasn't ready to abandon, despite the growing suspicion around us. And with each passing day, I felt myself slipping further into a world where the line between right and wrong had blurred, where love and desire had become both a solace and a curse. The delicate web I was weaving felt like it might unravel at any moment, especially as Heward began to notice the subtle changes in my behavior. Heward, my steady and practical husband of nearly 50 years, had always been attentive in his quiet way, though the years had made our relationship less vibrant, more like an enduring partnership than the romance it had once been. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, he set down his newspaper and turned to me. his gaze thoughtful. "Mara," he said, his voice tinged with an unfamiliar concern. "Are you all right? You seem different lately. Distant, even." I felt a pang of guilt, knowing that my thoughts had drifted increasingly to Tylo, that I had been less attentive to Heward, lost in a world he couldn't understand. I forced a smile, trying to reassure him. "I'm fine, Heward, just busy with classes and my own work." But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the subtle furrow in his brow as he studied me. Heward had always been a perceptive man, and I knew that my dismissive answer wouldn't satisfy him for long. He reached over, placing a gentle hand on mine, a gesture that felt both comforting and laden with a sense of loss. "If there's anything you need to talk about, Mara, I'm here. You know that, don't you?" His words, filled with genuine care, struck a painful chord. Here was the man who had stood by me through every phase of my life, the one who had built a life with me, filled with shared dreams, memories, and moments of quiet companionship. Yet in that instant, I felt the full weight of my betrayal, the realization that I was hiding a part of myself from the person who deserved my honesty the most. "I know, Heward," I replied softly, squeezing his hand. "Thank you. I just need a little space. I promise it's nothing serious." He nodded, though his gaze remained thoughtful, as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle he couldn't quite grasp. And as I looked into his eyes, I felt a deep sense of remorse, a recognition that the love I had for Taylo was endangering something far more important, the life and trust I had shared with Heward. The following week, as I was leaving my studio with Taylo after a late session, I was caught off guard by Ivania standing at the doorway, her expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. I froze, feeling a wave of panic wash over me as her gaze shifted from me to Taylo, her eyes narrowing as she tried to process the scene before her. "Mom?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. "What's going on here?" I struggled to maintain my composure, forcing a smile as I replied, "Ivania, I was just finishing up a late session with Tylo. He's one of my students." Her gaze remained fixed on me, her eyes sharp and probing. "It's nearly midnight. What kind of art session takes place this late?" The accusation in her tone was unmistakable, and I felt the walls of my carefully constructed world closing in. Tylo sensed the tension and quickly excused himself, mumbling a polite goodbye before slipping out, leaving me alone with Ivania's accusatory stare. As the door closed, she crossed her arms, her voice cold. "Mom, are you involved with him?" The words hung in the air, a stark and painful reminder of the boundaries I had crossed. I opened my mouth to deny it, to insist that it was nothing more than a professional relationship, but the look in her eyes told me she wouldn't believe any excuse I made. "Ivania," I began, my voice trembling, "It's not what you think." She shook her head, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "Really? Because it looks exactly like what I think. Do you even understand what you're risking, Mom? Your marriage, our family, everything you've built?" Her words cut deep, each one a painful reminder of the reality I had tried to ignore. I felt a wave of shame wash over me, a realization that my actions had put everything I valued at risk. "Ivania, I don't know what to say. I didn't plan for this to happen. It just did." She looked at me with a mixture of disappointment and hurt. "That's not good enough, Mom. You can't just brush this off as something that just happened. You have a family, a husband who loves you, and you're throwing it all away for some fling with a student?" Her words struck like a knife, and I felt the full weight of her accusation settling over me. I knew she was right, that my choices had been reckless, selfish, and hurtful. But even as I stood there, filled with regret, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that the connection with Taylo was real, that it had awakened something in me I couldn't easily let go of. Ivania shook her head, her expression filled with disappointment. "I don't know who you are anymore, Mom, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the empty studio, the silence filled with the echoes of her condemnation. As if Ivania's discovery wasn't enough, Calder paid me a visit a few days later, his expression grim and unyielding. He had always been a straightforward man, never one to mince words, and I could tell from the look in his eyes that he knew something was amiss. We sat in my studio, the air thick with tension as he leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. "Mara, I think it's time we have a frank conversation. Heward is worried about you. He's noticed a change, and frankly, so have I." I felt my pulse quicken, a familiar pang of anxiety settling in my chest. "Calder, I appreciate your concern, but I assure you everything is fine." He shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "You're lying, Mara, and we both know it." The bluntness of his accusation left me momentarily speechless, and I struggled to find the right words to deflect his suspicion. But Calder wasn't one to be easily swayed, and he continued, his tone growing more intense. "I've known you and Heward for over 30 years. I know when something is off, and I'm not going to sit back and watch you destroy your marriage for whatever this is." The force of his words left me reeling, and I felt a surge of anger rise within me. "You have no right to interfere, Calder. This is my life, my choice. You don't get to judge me." He leaned back, his expression calm but resolute. "Maybe I don't, but Heward deserves better than this. He's devoted his life to you, and he deserves the truth. So here's my ultimatum, Mara. Either you end this, whatever it is, or I tell Heward myself." The threat hung in the air, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. Calder had always been loyal to Heward, but this was a betrayal I hadn't anticipated. I knew that if he followed through, everything I had tried to keep hidden would be laid bare, and I would lose the life I had spent decades building. For a long moment, I sat in silence, grappling with the reality of Calder's ultimatum. I knew that he was serious, that he would carry out his threat if I didn't comply. And as I looked into his determined gaze, I realized that my only choice was to end the affair, to walk away from the one thing that had brought me a sense of freedom, of passion, that I hadn't felt in years. But even as I nodded, agreeing to his terms, I felt a hollow ache settle in my chest, a recognition that I was about to lose something I couldn't easily replace. Calder left without another word, his presence a lingering reminder of the consequences I was now facing. The following day, I met with Tylo, knowing that I had to end things, that the risk was too great to ignore. He arrived at the studio with a bright smile, his eyes lighting up as he saw me, a reminder of the joy I had found in his presence. But as he sensed the gravity of my expression, his smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Mara, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with worry. I took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "Taylo, we can't keep doing this. It's too complicated, too dangerous. My family, they're starting to notice, and it's putting everything I have at risk." He looked at me, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Mara, I thought we had something real. I thought you felt the same way I did." I nodded, my heart aching with the weight of my decision. "I do, Taylo. But it's not sustainable. I can't keep lying to my family, to myself." He fell silent, his gaze downcast, and after a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "Mara, I need to tell you something. The art I've been working on, it's been inspired by you. By us." His confession caught me off guard, and I looked at him in shock, the implications of his words sinking in. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then continued, his gaze filled with vulnerability. "Our relationship, it's been the heart of my work. I wanted to capture the intensity, the beauty of what we have. But now, I don't know what to do." The realization that he had been using our affair as inspiration for his art left me feeling both flattered and betrayed, a reminder that the boundaries between us had always been blurred. And as I looked at him, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. A recognition that our connection, as real as it had felt, was perhaps always destined to end. It was just after dinner when Heward finally confronted me. He'd been quiet through the meal, his gaze distant, his usual steady presence tinged with an unfamiliar coldness. As I cleared the dishes, I could feel his eyes on me, a heaviness in the air that I couldn't ignore. "Mara," he said finally, his voice low and steady, "we need to talk." I set the plates down, my pulse quickening as I turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, his gaze unwavering as he studied me with an intensity that left me feeling exposed. "What is it, Heward?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though a sense of dread was already settling over me. He took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly together as if bracing himself. "I've noticed a change in you. You're different, Mara, distant, and I can't shake the feeling that there's something you're not telling me." I opened my mouth to respond, to offer some sort of reassurance, but he continued before I could speak, his voice tinged with a pain that struck me deeply. "Calder told me he's concerned that he's seen you with one of your students outside of class hours. He suspects more than just a teacher-student relationship." The impact of his words was immediate, a shockwave that left me reeling, struggling to process the fact that Calder had betrayed me, that Heward knew, or at least suspected, the truth. I felt the blood drain from my face, my carefully constructed world unraveling in an instant. "Heward, My voice faltered, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, robbing me of any plausible explanation. He looked at me, his gaze filled with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "Is it true, Mara? Have you been involved with him?" The rawness of his question left me breathless, and I realized that I couldn't lie to him. Not after everything we'd shared, the life we had built together. I felt a wave of shame wash over me as I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I made a mistake, Heward. A terrible mistake." He closed his eyes, a pained expression crossing his face as he absorbed my confession. For a long moment he said nothing, his silence heavy with disappointment, with a betrayal that I knew could never be fully mended. When he finally spoke, his voice was a quiet, hollow whisper. "Why, Mara? After everything we've been through, everything we've built, why?" I felt a lump form in my throat, a mixture of regret and longing as I struggled to find the words. "I don't know, Heward. I was lonely. I felt invisible, like I was fading away. And with Tylo, I felt alive again, like I mattered." He looked at me, his gaze filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "And what about us? Did we mean so little to you?" His question left me speechless, a reminder of the depth of the pain I had caused, of the trust I had broken. I wanted to tell him that he mattered, that our life together had been real, that I loved him still. But the words felt hollow, empty in the face of what I had done. For the first time in our marriage, Heward looked at me as though I were a stranger, someone he could no longer understand. And as he stood up, walking away without another word, I felt the full weight of my choices settle over me, a burden that I knew I would carry for the rest of my life. In the days that followed, I was a shadow of myself, moving through life with a sense of numbness, a hollowness that echoed with the loss of everything I had once held dear. Heward avoided me, his presence a silent reminder of the trust I had shattered, of the life we had built that now lay in ruins. I knew what I had to do, though the thought filled me with a deep, aching sorrow. Tylo had been my escape, a glimpse of a world I had thought was lost to me, but I couldn't keep lying to myself, pretending that our connection could justify the destruction it had caused. I needed to let him go, to sever the bond that had become both a solace and a curse. I met him at the studio, the place that had once been our sanctuary, now filled with memories that felt both precious and painful. He sensed the finality in my demeanor as soon as I walked in, his gaze filled with a quiet sadness that mirrored my own. "Mara," he said softly, his voice laced with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "You're ending this, aren't you?" I nodded, my throat tight as I struggled to hold back tears. I have to, Taylor. It's tearing my life apart. I can't keep hurting the people I care about. He looked down, his expression somber, and I could see the pain in his eyes, the recognition that our time together was coming to an end. For a long moment, we stood in silence, each of us lost in the memories of what we had shared, the moments of joy and passion that had filled the emptiness in both our lives. I never meant for this to happen, he murmured, his voice filled with regret. I didn't expect to feel this way about you. I felt a pang of sorrow, a recognition that we had both been swept up in something beyond our control, a connection that had brought both joy and destruction. Neither did I, Taylor, but we can't keep living in this fantasy. It's not real, not in the way it should be. He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. Maybe you're right, but for what it's worth, you made me feel like I could be someone, like I mattered. I'll always be grateful for that. We shared a final embrace, a quiet goodbye filled with both love and loss, a recognition that we had been part of each other's lives, even if only briefly. And as he walked away, I felt a hollow ache settle in my chest, a reminder of what I had lost, of the life I had chosen to leave behind. With Tylo gone, I turned my attention to the wreckage of my family, the fractured bonds I had caused, the trust that had been eroded by my actions. Heward remained distant, his silence filled with a pain that I knew words couldn't easily mend. But I was determined to try, to find a way to rebuild the life I had nearly destroyed. One evening, as I sat across from him, I gathered the courage to speak, my voice filled with a quiet resolve. Heward, I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try, to make things right, if you'll let me. He looked at me, his gaze heavy with hurt and betrayal. And how exactly do you plan to do that, Mara? How do you plan to fix the damage you've done? His words stung, a reminder of the depth of the pain I had caused. But I met his gaze, a mixture of remorse and determination in my eyes. I don't have all the answers, Heward, but I'm willing to try, to put in the work, to be the wife you deserve. For a long moment he said nothing, his silence filled with a quiet contemplation that left me feeling both hopeful and uncertain. And then, with a sigh, he nodded, a faint glimmer of acceptance in his gaze. It won't be easy, Mara. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I suppose we can start there. His words were a small consolation, a hint of hope that perhaps in time we could find a way to heal. And as we began the slow process of rebuilding our life together, I felt a sense of gratitude, a recognition that love, even in its most broken form, could still hold the power to mend. Meanwhile, I reached out to Ivania, seeking to bridge the gap that had grown between us. Our conversations were strained, filled with the remnants of anger and disappointment that she couldn't easily let go. But as I shared my regrets, my desire to reconnect, she began to soften, her guarded demeanor giving way to a tentative acceptance. Through these small acts of reconciliation, I began to find a path forward, a way to piece together the fragments of my life, to forge a future rooted in honesty and forgiveness. The weeks that followed were filled with a silence that allowed my thoughts to settle, a solitude that became both a comfort and a constant reminder of the choices I'd made. Taylor's absence left an emptiness, a hollow ache that I knew wasn't just for him, but for the person he had made me feel like I could be, a version of myself that I hadn't seen in years. But as I sat alone in my studio, sketching or lost in thought, I began to realize that maybe it wasn't him I missed. Maybe it was a part of me I'd thought was gone. I started journaling, pouring my emotions onto the pages late at night, finding solace in the quiet act of writing down the fragments of my life that I was only just beginning to understand. With each page, I unearthed memories, longings, pieces of myself that had been buried under the responsibilities of family, marriage, and time. There were entries about Heward, of course. I reflected on our early days, the nights we'd spent wrapped in each other's warmth, our dreams merging as we built a life together. He'd been my steadfast partner, the one who saw me at my best and my worst. Yet somewhere along the way, I had let the routine of life overshadow the depth of that connection. I wrote about my love for him, the regret I felt for letting it wane, for seeking something new instead of nurturing what we had built together. And then there were the entries about Taylo, where I let myself be honest, confronting the truth that I had been reluctant to face. I admitted to myself that the thrill of our affair had been a rekindling of something in me that I thought was lost. Creativity, passion, a reminder that I was alive. But it was also a fantasy, a temporary escape from the responsibilities and expectations that had begun to feel like chains. Taylo had shown me a reflection of myself that was both exhilarating and frightening. And while I couldn't deny the depth of my feelings, I could now see them for what they were. A moment in time, a spark that had given me the courage to rediscover parts of myself. As I closed my journal each night, I felt a sense of closure settling over me, a realization that I was ready to face the future with a renewed sense of who I was and what I truly valued. It was no longer about seeking fulfillment in someone else. It was about finding peace within myself. As I continued to write, I found myself returning to my art with a renewed energy, a creativity that had been dormant for years. My studio became my sanctuary, a place where I could channel my emotions, my memories, and my newfound sense of self into each brushstroke, each line. The canvas became a mirror, reflecting not only the pain I had endured, but also the resilience and strength I had found in the aftermath. I began working on a new series, pieces that captured the journey I had taken, the complexity of love and betrayal, the beauty of rediscovering oneself in the face of heartache. These paintings were raw and unfiltered, each one an exploration of the emotions I had kept hidden for so long. There were moments of darkness, shades of gray and black symbolizing the guilt and regret, but there were also vibrant hues of red and gold, representing the passion, the hope, the resilience that had carried me through. One day, as I stood back to look at a nearly completed canvas, I felt a sense of pride that I hadn't felt in years. This was my work, my truth, laid bare for the world to see. And while I knew that not everyone would understand, that some might judge or condemn, I was ready to face that. Because these pieces, this expression of who I was, had become my lifeline, a reminder that I could create beauty even from the broken parts of myself. I reached out to a local gallery owner, an acquaintance from years back, who had always appreciated my work. She was thrilled to hear from me, and after seeing my new pieces, she eagerly offered to showcase them in an upcoming exhibition. The prospect filled me with both excitement and trepidation. This wasn't just an exhibition. It was a public display of my journey, my struggles, my redemption. When the night of the exhibition arrived, I stood in the gallery, surrounded by friends, family, and strangers, each of them observing the pieces that had become a part of me. Heward was there, his presence a quiet support that meant more than words could express. Ivania too had come, and though our relationship was still fragile, there was a glimmer of understanding in her eyes as she looked at my work. I felt a sense of closure as I moved through the crowd, speaking with guests, sharing my story through the art that lined the walls. This wasn't just an exhibition. It was a declaration of resilience, a testament to the power of self-reflection and growth. And as I stood there surrounded by people who had been part of my life in one way or another, I felt a peace settle over me, a knowledge that I was ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold. In the months that followed, I began to find a new rhythm, a life that was rooted in both acceptance and hope. Heward and I were taking small steps, our relationship still fragile, but grounded in a shared determination to rebuild what we had once cherished. He was quieter than before, his presence tinged with a sadness that I knew would take time to heal. But there were moments, small gestures, that reminded me of the love we still shared, of the foundation that had held us together for nearly 50 years. One evening, as we sat together in the garden, watching the sunset, he reached for my hand, his touch gentle and familiar. It was a simple act, one that spoke of forgiveness, of a willingness to move forward despite the pain we had endured. "We'll get through this, Mara," he said quietly, his gaze filled with a quiet strength that reminded me of the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. "It might take time, but I believe we can find our way back." His words filled me with a renewed sense of hope, a reminder that love, even in its most broken form, could still be a source of healing. And as we sat there, hand in hand, I felt a warmth settle over me, a knowledge that we were both willing to do the work, to rebuild the life we had almost lost. With Ivania, the journey was slower, our relationship filled with moments of tension and misunderstandings. But as we continued to talk, to confront the pain and resentment that had built up over the years, I began to see glimpses of the closeness we had once shared. She had her own journey, her own healing to do, and while I couldn't change the past, I was determined to be present for her, to offer the support and understanding that I had once neglected. One afternoon, she visited me at the studio, her eyes filled with a quiet curiosity as she observed the paintings that now lined the walls. "You've really poured your soul into these, haven't you?" she murmured, her voice tinged with admiration. I nodded, a sense of pride filling me as I looked at my work. "It's been healing, in ways I didn't expect." She glanced at me, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Maybe we could go to the gallery together sometime. I'd like to hear more about the stories behind each piece." Her words were a small olive branch, a hint of the bond we were beginning to rebuild. And I felt a surge of gratitude, a recognition that while the road to forgiveness was long, it was one we were both willing to walk. As the seasons changed, so did I. Each day a step toward a future that was both uncertain and filled with possibility. I knew that the scars of my choices would remain, a reminder of the pain I had caused and the lessons I had learned. But I also knew that those scars were part of my story, a testament to the resilience and strength that had carried me through. I found myself embracing life with a renewed sense of purpose, each moment a reminder of the beauty that could be found in growth, in forgiveness, in the act of rebuilding. And as I looked ahead, I felt a quiet certainty that whatever lay in store, I was ready to face it. A wiser, stronger woman who had found her way back to herself. Months later, as I walked through the gallery, now filled with the quiet admiration of visitors, I felt a deep sense of contentment. My journey had brought me to a place of understanding, a knowledge that life, in all its complexity, was a gift to be cherished. Ivania joined me, her presence a comforting reminder of the healing we had found together. We stood side by side, observing the pieces that had become a testament to my journey, a reflection of the love, the mistakes, and the resilience that had shaped my life. As we turned to leave, I looked at her, a sense of pride filling me. "Thank you, Ivania, for being here, for forgiving me." She smiled, a warmth in her gaze that spoke of acceptance. "We've come a long way, Mom, and I'm glad we did." And as we walked out into the light, I felt a quiet peace settle over me, a knowledge that I had reclaimed my life, my purpose, and my family. And in that moment, I knew that whatever lay ahead, I was ready, grateful for the journey that had brought me here, and hopeful for the future that awaited. There are moments that feel so small at the time, so innocuous, that you don't realize their significance until much later. For me, it started with something as simple as a dress. Victor and I were hosting one of his famous dinner parties, a meticulously planned affair filled with his business colleagues and their equally polished spouses. I'd chosen a navy blue cocktail dress, sleek and understated, but elegant enough to fit in with Victor's high-achieving crowd. The zipper, however, had other plans. I stood in front of the mirror, twisting and reaching, trying in vain to pull it up. The angle was impossible, and Victor, as always, was already too busy on a call to help. Frustration bubbled inside me as I fumbled with the stubborn fabric. Need a hand? The voice startled me, and I turned to see Adrian standing in the doorway. He held a casual ease about him, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans. Yes, actually, I admitted, my cheeks flushing. He stepped closer, his expression calm but focused. Turn around, he said softly. I obeyed, holding my breath as his hands found the zipper. His fingers brushed against my back as he pulled it up slowly, the touch sending an unexpected shiver down my spine. All done, he said, stepping back. I turned to thank him, but the words caught in my throat when our eyes met. There was something in his gaze, something unspoken but undeniable, that made my heart race. Thank you, I managed, my voice softer than I intended. He nodded, lingering for a moment before turning and walking away. As I watched him go, I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to calm the rapid thudding of my heart. It was just a zipper, I told myself. Just an innocent moment. But deep down, I knew better. The dinner party went off without a hitch. Victor schmoozed, his guests laughed at all the right moments, and I played the role of the supportive, perfectly put-together wife. But the entire evening, I felt like I was operating in a haze. Adrian's touch lingered in my mind like a whisper, faint but insistent. I found myself stealing glances at him from across the room, trying to convince myself that what I'd felt had been a fleeting moment of vulnerability. He was polite, reserved even, keeping mostly to himself throughout the evening. But when our eyes met briefly over the rim of my wineglass, my pulse quickened. The next morning, I woke early, hoping to shake off the strange energy that had gripped me. The house was quiet, with Victor already gone to an early meeting. As I stood in the kitchen brewing coffee, Adrian walked in, his hair slightly mussed, wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants. Morning, he said, his voice still rough from sleep. Good morning, I replied, trying to sound casual. He grabbed a mug and poured himself some coffee, leaning against the counter as he took a sip. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged. Last night went well, he said, finally breaking the quiet. Yes, I replied, though my thoughts were miles away. Victor always loves hosting those parties. Adrian chuckled softly. It's not really your scene, is it? I glanced at him, startled by his observation. What makes you say that? He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. You just seemed different, like you were putting on a show. His words hit closer to home than I cared to admit. That's part of the job, I said lightly, trying to deflect. You shouldn't have to perform for people, he said, his tone sincere. You're better than that. The earnestness in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt my cheeks flush. Before I could respond, he set his mug down and headed toward the door. See you later, he said over his shoulder, leaving me alone with the thundering of my heart. Over the next few days, I tried to create distance between us. I kept myself busy with errands and chores, avoiding being alone in the same room. But it seemed like Adrian was everywhere, offering to help carry groceries, fixing a squeaky cabinet door, or simply lingering in the kitchen while I cooked. It wasn't just his presence that unsettled me. It was the way I noticed him now. The way his laughter lit up a room, the subtle strength in his movements, the kindness in his eyes when he spoke to me. The tension between us came to a head one afternoon when we were in the living room. I was rearranging some books on the shelf, and he was lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone. You don't have to do all that, he said, setting his phone aside. I like keeping things organized, I replied without turning around. He stood and walked over, standing just behind me. Here, he said, reaching up to grab a book on the top shelf that I couldn't quite reach. His arm brushed against mine, and I froze, the proximity sending a jolt through me. Thanks, I said quickly, stepping back. You're welcome, he said softly, his gaze locking with mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The space between us felt charged, like a wire stretched too tight, ready to snap. Adrian, I began, my voice trembling. We can't. I know, he said, cutting me off gently, but it's hard to ignore. I looked away, my chest tightening. We're not having this conversation. He nodded, stepping back to give me space. Okay, but if you ever want to, I'm here. His words hung in the air long after he left the room. That evening, I found myself lingering in the garden, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The roses I'd planted years ago were in full bloom, their scent filling the evening air. You like it out here, don't you? Adrian's voice startled me, and I turned to see him standing a few feet away. I needed some quiet, I said, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. He nodded, stepping closer. I get it, it's peaceful. We stood in silence for a moment, the soft chirping of crickets, the only sound. Then he spoke again, his voice low. You don't have to do this alone, he said. I turned to him, frowning. What do you mean? You take care of everything, he said, his eyes searching mine. The house, Victor, the parties, but who takes care of you? His question left me speechless. No one had ever asked me that before, not even Victor. I can take care of myself, I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. I don't doubt that, he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. But maybe you don't have to. The sincerity in his words made my chest ache, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek before I could stop it. Adrian, this is complicated, I said, my voice trembling. I know, he said softly, but that doesn't mean it's not real. For weeks, the air in the house felt different. Every glance Adrian and I exchanged, every shared space, seemed charged with an unspoken energy we couldn't escape. I told myself it was nothing, that it would pass if I ignored it. But denial was useless when every stolen moment only pulled us closer. One sunny afternoon, Adrian was outside mowing the lawn while I pruned the rose bushes along the garden path. The hum of the mower filled the air, punctuated by the rhythmic chirping of birds. I focused on snipping dead stems, but my attention drifted to Adrian as he moved across the yard, his shirt sticking to his back in the heat. Need some water? I called, forcing my tone to stay light. He turned off the mower, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. That'd be great, he replied, flashing me a grateful smile. I went inside to grab a glass of iced water, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't explain. When I returned, he was sitting on the garden bench, the mower forgotten. Here, I said, handing him the glass. Thanks, he said, taking a long sip. I sat beside him, wiping dirt from my gloves. For a moment neither of us spoke, then he broke the silence. You've been avoiding me, he said, his voice steady but tinged with something unspoken. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. I've been busy, I said finally. He set the glass down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. You don't have to lie, Lorraine. I can feel it too. My breath caught, and I turned to look at him. His expression was open, vulnerable, and it made my chest ache. This, whatever it is, I said, gesturing between us, it's dangerous. I know, he said softly, but that doesn't make it any less real. The tension came to a head one evening when Victor announced he'd be gone for a week on a business trip. Another deal in Chicago, he said over dinner, barely glancing up from his phone. You'll manage without me, right? Of course, I replied, my voice even. Adrian said nothing, but I could feel his gaze flick to me briefly. After Victor left, the house felt emptier, quieter, but not in the comforting way it usually did. That night, I found Adrian in the kitchen, leaning against the counter as he scrolled through his phone. Can't sleep? I asked, my voice soft. He looked up, setting his phone aside. Not really. Me neither, I admitted, pouring myself a glass of water. We stood in silence for a moment, the stillness of the house wrapping around us. Then he spoke. Lorraine, he began, his voice hesitant. I don't want to make things harder for you. You're not, I said quickly, though the words felt hollow. I think I am, he said, stepping closer. Every time I'm near you, I can't stop thinking about everything I shouldn't be thinking about. His honesty took my breath away, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Adrian, this can't happen, I whispered. But it already is, he said, his voice breaking. I shook my head, stepping back. We have to stop this before it gets out of hand. He nodded slowly, though his expression was pained. If that's what you want. But as I turned to leave, his voice stopped me. Do you want me to leave? He asked quietly. I froze, my heart pounding. When I turned back to him, the look in his eyes undid me. No, I admitted, my voice barely audible. Over the next few days, we found ourselves drawn together in small, seemingly innocent ways. We worked in the garden, cooked dinner together, and shared long conversations late into the night. Each moment felt like a step closer to the line we both knew we shouldn't cross. One evening, after dinner, we sat on the back porch, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the yard. Tell me something, Adrian said, his tone light. Like what? I asked, taking a sip of wine. Something about you, he said, his gaze steady. Something you don't tell anyone else. I hesitated, unsure what to say. I don't know, I said finally. I'm not sure there's much to tell. I don't believe that, he said with a small smile. I looked away, my chest tightening. Sometimes I feel like I don't know who I am anymore, I admitted. Like I've spent so much time being what everyone else needs that I forgot who I was supposed to be. His smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. I know the feeling, he said softly. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared vulnerability settling between us. Lorraine, he said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. You don't have to keep pretending with me. His words made my chest ache, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek before I could stop it. Adrian, this is so complicated, I said, my voice trembling. Life is complicated, he said, his tone gentle, but that doesn't mean we should ignore what's real. A few days later, Helen, a close family friend, stopped by unexpectedly. Just thought I'd check in, she said brightly, stepping into the house with a bottle of wine. Victor's out of town, I said, forcing a smile. Perfect timing, she said with a laugh. Girls' night. Adrian appeared in the doorway, his expression neutral. Helen, he said politely. Adrian, she replied, her tone warm but slightly teasing. Still hanging around, I see. He smiled faintly but said nothing, retreating back upstairs. After a glass of wine, Helen leaned closer, her expression turning serious. You and Adrian seem close these days. Her comment sent a jolt through me, but I kept my face neutral. He's just been helping out around the house, I said casually. Of course, she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Her words stayed with me long after she left, a reminder of how precarious our situation had become. That night, I found Adrian in the garden, his hands deep in the soil as he tended to the roses. You're still out here? I asked, stepping closer. He looked up, brushing dirt from his hands. Couldn't sleep. Neither could I, but I didn't say it. Instead, I knelt beside him, the cool earth grounding me. We need to be careful, I said finally. I know, he replied, his voice quiet. But as our eyes met in the dim light, I realized that no amount of caution could stop what was happening between us. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that felt more like anticipation than peace. Victor was still out of town, and the house had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and dangerous. I couldn't focus on anything, my thoughts swirling with all the moments Adrian and I had almost crossed the line, but hadn't. I was in the living room, absent-mindedly flipping through a book I wasn't reading, when Adrian appeared in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the frame, his presence filling the room. You're up late, he said finally, his voice soft. I couldn't sleep, I replied, closing the book. He nodded, stepping into the room. Neither could I. He sat down on the couch across from me, his gaze steady but unreadable. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, like we were both waiting for something to happen. Lorraine, he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. I looked at him, my heart skipping a beat at the intensity in his eyes. What is it? I don't know if I can keep pretending this is normal, he said, his voice low but firm. My breath caught, and I set the book aside. Adrian, we've talked about this, it's just, don't. He interrupted gently. Don't tell me it's nothing. We both know that's not true. I looked away, my chest tightening. It's complicated, I whispered. Everything worth having is, he said softly. His words made my throat tighten, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. This, whatever it is between us, it can't happen, I said, my voice trembling. Why not? He asked, leaning forward. Because it's wrong, I said, though the conviction in my voice wavered. Does it feel wrong? He pressed, his tone gentle but insistent. I opened my mouth to respond but found I didn't have an answer. The room felt smaller, the space between us shrinking with every passing second. When Adrian moved to sit beside me, I didn't stop him. His presence was warm, grounding, but also intoxicating. I see you, Lorraine, he said quietly. Not the version of you everyone else expects, but the real you. His words unraveled me, and before I could stop myself, I turned to face him. Adrian, this is dangerous, I said, my voice shaking. I know, he replied, but I don't care. When his hand brushed against mine, it was like a spark igniting a fire I'd been trying to suppress. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let him take my hand, his grip firm but gentle. Tell me to stop, he said softly, his eyes searching mine. I couldn't. The kiss started slowly, tentatively, as though we were both testing the waters. But as I leaned into him, it deepened, a rush of emotions spilling over that I couldn't contain. His hands rested lightly on my waist, not grounding me even as my thoughts spun out of control. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless. I looked at him, my heart pounding. "We shouldn't have done that," I whispered. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice steady. I hesitated, my chest tightening. "No," I admitted. He nodded, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "Neither do I." The hours that followed were a blur of vulnerability and confession. We talked about everything. His frustrations with Victor, my loneliness in a marriage that had become more of a partnership than a relationship, the way we both felt seen by each other, in ways no one else seemed to understand. "You deserve to be happy," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "So do you," I replied, my voice breaking. His lips found mine again, and this time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. The next morning, the house felt different. The tension that had lingered between us for weeks was gone, replaced by a sense of quiet intimacy. But with it came the weight of reality. As I stood in the kitchen making coffee, Adrian appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said, his voice soft. "Morning," I replied, handing him a mug. We stood in silence for a moment, the enormity of what had happened settling between us. "What happens now?" he asked finally, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I looked at him, my chest tightening. "I don't know," I admitted. He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "I don't want to make things harder for you." "You're not," I said quickly, though the words felt hollow. He gave me a small, sad smile. "We'll figure it out." As the day went on, the reality of our situation began to sink in. I knew we couldn't keep this a secret forever. Victor would come home, and the fragile bubble we'd created would burst. But for now, I allowed myself to savor the stolen moments, his hand brushing against mine as we passed in the hallway, the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. But even as I reveled in the connection we'd found, a small voice in the back of my mind reminded me of the consequences. And I knew it was only a matter of time before we'd have to face them. For the next week, Adrian and I existed in a fragile, exhilarating bubble. We found excuses to spend time together, working in the garden, preparing meals, or sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. Every glance, every touch carried the weight of our secret, but we couldn't seem to stay apart. One morning, I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables when Adrian came in, a faint smile on his lips. "Need any help?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "I've got it," I said, glancing at him. He didn't move, just watched me with an intensity that made my hands tremble. "You're different when it's just us," he said suddenly. I paused, looking up at him. "Different how?" "You're lighter," he said softly. Happy his words hit me harder than they should have. "I guess I don't feel like I have to perform," I admitted. "You shouldn't have to," he said, stepping closer. "Not for me. Not for anyone." The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache, and I quickly turned back to the cutting board, trying to focus on the task at hand. But his presence was impossible to ignore. That evening, we sat on the back porch again, the air warm and still. I sipped a glass of wine, watching the way the light played across the yard. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Adrian asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Leaving?" I repeated, frowning. "This house, this life," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but it's not that simple." "Why not?" he asked, turning to look at me. "Because it's not just about me," I said. "There are expectations, responsibilities. None of that matters if you're not happy," he said, his voice gentle but firm. I looked away, my chest tightening. "It's not that easy." "It could be," he said softly. His words lingered in the air and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Adrian, I don't know how to." I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "You don't have to figure it out all at once," he said, reaching for my hand. "But you deserve to be happy, Lorraine. You deserve to feel alive." The next day, a family friend, Helen, stopped by unexpectedly. "Just thought I'd drop this off," she said, holding up a container of cookies as she stepped inside. "Thank you," I said, forcing a smile. She glanced around the house, her sharp eyes taking everything in. "Adrian still staying here?" she asked casually. "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. She nodded, her expression unreadable. You two seem to be spending a lot of time together. The comment sent a jolt through me, but I kept my face neutral. He's just been helping out around the house, I said lightly. Of course, she said with a small smile, though something in her tone made my stomach twist. That evening, Adrian and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The house was quiet, and the weight of Helen's words hung heavily in my mind. She knows, I said quietly, breaking the silence. Adrian looked at me, his brow furrowing. Helen? She didn't say it outright, but I could tell, I said, my voice trembling. What did she say? He asked, his tone calm but serious. Just little things. Comments about us spending time together. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. We'll be more careful. Maybe this was a mistake, I said, my voice breaking. Don't say that, he said firmly, stepping closer. You don't mean it. I don't know what I mean anymore, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. He pulled me into his arms, his touch steadying me. Lorraine, look at me, he said softly. I did, my breath catching at the intensity in his gaze. This isn't a mistake, he said. What we have, it's real. The tension between us and the outside world grew sharper with each passing day. Victor called from Chicago one evening, his tone distracted but vaguely curious. How's Adrian doing? He asked. He's fine, I said, keeping my voice even. Spending a lot of time around the house, isn't he? Victor said lightly, though there was an edge to his tone. He's just helping out, I said quickly. Victor replied, and the line went quiet for a moment before he changed the subject. The close call came a few days later. Victor had said he wouldn't be back until the weekend, but I heard the sound of his car in the driveway late one evening. Adrian, I hissed, rushing into the living room where he was sitting. Victor's home. His eyes widened, and he stood quickly. I'll head upstairs, he said, his voice calm but urgent. Just as he disappeared up the stairs, Victor walked through the door, his expression tired but alert. You're back early, I said, forcing a smile. Meetings wrapped up faster than expected, he said, glancing around the house. Where's Adrian? In his room, I said quickly. Victor nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary before he turned away. That night, I lay awake, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I knew we couldn't keep this up forever. Sooner or later, the truth would come out, and the fallout would be devastating. But as I thought of Adrian, his touch, his words, the way he made me feel seen, I couldn't bring myself to end it. We were walking a tightrope, and I didn't know how much longer we could stay balanced. Victor's return was earlier than expected, throwing the delicate balance of the house into chaos. I had been careful, so had Adrian, but the inevitability of tension resurfaced the moment Victor walked through the door, his usual air of indifference replaced with something sharper. Home early, I said, feigning calm as I greeted him at the door. Deal wrapped faster than planned, he replied, his voice curt. Figured I'd surprise you. Surprise was an understatement. The timing of his arrival disrupted the fragile quiet Adrian and I had settled into. Adrian kept his distance that evening, retreating to his room while Victor paced the living room with a drink in hand, his demeanor more restless than usual. You've been quiet lately, Victor remarked, his eyes narrowing as he sat across from me on the couch. I've been busy, I replied, hoping my voice sounded neutral. With what? He pressed, his tone sharper than I expected. Just the usual. Keeping the house in order, running errands. I tried to keep my response light, but the weight of his gaze made my chest tighten. Adrian's been around a lot, he said suddenly, his words cutting through the air like a knife. He lives here, I replied evenly, though my pulse quickened. Victor leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He's an adult, doesn't he have somewhere else to be? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Victor's eyes were piercing, as if he was searching for something just beneath the surface. The tension escalated the next morning when Victor walked into the kitchen, holding a book he'd found on the living room shelf. Inside it, a folded note slipped from between the pages, landing on the counter with a soft rustle. "What's this?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. My heart stopped. It was a note Adrian had written to me days ago, a simple thank you for a shared moment in the garden, but the familiarity in his words would raise questions Victor wouldn't ignore. "I don't know," I said quickly, reaching for it. Victor grabbed it first, his eyes scanning the page, his expression darkened. "Care to explain?" It's nothing, I said, forcing a laugh. Adrian must have left it by mistake. By mistake, Victor repeated, his voice colder now. Seems personal. Before I could respond, Adrian entered the kitchen. He froze, his eyes darting between us. Something you'd like to share, son? Victor asked, his voice sharp. Adrian's jaw tightened. No, nothing at all. Victor held the note up. Then why does this feel like more than nothing? Because you're overthinking, I interjected, stepping between them. Victor, it's just a note. Let it go. Victor's gaze bore into me, and for a moment, I thought he might press further. But instead, he dropped the note onto the counter and walked out of the room without another word. That evening, Adrian and I found ourselves in the garden, the tension from the day still lingering. He's on to us, Adrian said quietly, his hands buried in his pockets. I nodded, my chest tightening. I know. We can't keep doing this, he said, his voice heavy with regret. My breath caught, and I turned to face him. Adrian? This isn't just about us anymore, he continued, his tone firm. If he finds out, really finds out, it won't end well for anyone. His words hit like a blow, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. So what are you saying? I'm saying maybe it's time for me to go, he said, his voice trembling. I can't stay here and make this harder for you. The thought of him leaving made my chest ache. But I knew he was right. The following morning, Adrian packed his things. I watched from the doorway as he folded his clothes into a suitcase, each movement deliberate, as if he was trying to hold himself together. When are you leaving? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tomorrow, he replied without looking up. I stepped into the room, my heart pounding. This doesn't have to be goodbye forever, I said, my voice trembling. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. Maybe not, he said softly, but it has to be goodbye for now. When Adrian left the next day, the house felt emptier than it ever had. Victor seemed oblivious, his focus returning to work as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the hollow ache in my chest. That evening, I found the note Adrian had left behind on the counter. Lorraine, I don't know how to say goodbye, so I won't. This isn't an end, it's just a pause. Thank you for everything. You've shown me more than I thought I'd ever see, and I'll carry that with me always. Take care of yourself. You deserve to be happy. Adrian, tears blurred the words as I read them, the weight of his absence settling over me. I folded the note carefully, tucking it away in a place I knew I'd return to when the ache became too much. For now, all I could do was wait and hope. The days after Adrian left felt hollow. The house, once filled with a quiet tension that hummed with unspoken emotions, was now just quiet. Victor, oblivious to the storm that had nearly unraveled his life, returned to his usual habits: long hours at work, brief conversations over dinner, and nights spent scrolling on his phone. I went through the motions, cleaning, organizing, and maintaining the illusion of normalcy. But everything felt empty. The note Adrian had left became both a comfort and a torment. A reminder of what I'd lost and what I'd never truly had the courage to hold on to. Victor noticed the change in me eventually, though his observations were surface level at best. You've been distant, he said one evening over dinner. I've had a lot on my mind, I replied, keeping my voice even. Anything I should know about? He pressed, his tone more curious than concerned. No, I said simply, taking a sip of water. He nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his plate. I realized in that moment how little he truly saw me. The realization didn't hurt anymore, it just was. Weeks turned into months, and I began to rebuild myself in small ways. I spent more time in the garden, tending to the roses Adrian and I had worked on together. Their blooms became a symbol of resilience, thriving despite the seasons of change. Diana, my best friend, noticed the subtle transformation in me. You seem different, she said over coffee one morning. Do I? I asked, a faint smile playing on my lips. Yes, she said, studying me. Lighter, almost. But there's something else, too. What happened, Lorraine? I hesitated, then shook my head. Nothing I'm ready to talk about, I admitted. She nodded, her expression understanding. Whatever it is, I'm here when you're ready. One afternoon, as I was pruning the roses, the mail arrived. Among the usual bills and advertisements was an envelope with no return address. My heart raced as I opened it, recognizing the handwriting immediately. Lorraine, I hope this finds you well. I've settled into a new city, a new life. but I think of you often. The time we shared is something I'll always cherish. You showed me what it means to be truly seen, and I hope you found some peace too. Maybe someday, when things are different, our paths will cross again. Until then, take care of yourself. You deserve to bloom. Adrian, tears slipped down my cheeks as I read the letter, but this time, they weren't only tears of sadness. There was a bittersweet hope in his words. A reminder that life moves forward, even when it feels like it's standing still. Victor and I continued our uneasy dance of coexistence, but I no longer felt trapped by it. The connection I'd shared with Adrian had awakened something in me. A reminder that I deserved more than going through the motions. As I stood in the garden that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a quiet resolve settle over me. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I was willing to find out.